Can I just say, before we jump into the craziness that was the ending of this episode, the background music that played when they're on their way to destroy war, it was probably about a minute and a half, give or take, that there was no dialogue, no sound effects, just simply music. And this show has very little music. There's been like 3 cases, I think, over these entire episodes that there's been a backdrop for music. And I really dug that. I thought it kind of complemented the atmosphere of the almost emptiness and wasteland approach on the visual direction. And yeah, this episode ends with seemingly Nozomi just gone. Is she actually dead? No idea. This show moves in such a way that this easily could just be she goes to another this world, we meet up with her before the final episode, or she's just gone, and that's just how it works. And the fact that we have, seriously has kind of got it in his head that he is the savior, that if God and, the hot teacher, everyone like that is saying, like, he's the best, then he clearly is the best. And it'll be interesting to see what his psyche will look like going forward, given the fact that he clearly recognizes he froze up there. And I really wasn't expecting anything all that explosive from this episode, because it was focused on a character who, honestly, I'm surprised we haven't seen this ability sooner. The idea to read minds, right? It's an ability that I think, given the tension that this show has laid out from characters almost like wanting to destroy others because they thought they were behind bad things occurring to them, if you could invade someone's private thoughts, that would be something that would have you probably similar to, what we saw at the very end of the episode where the chickens were hung up and they were being fed for dinner. You don't want to be looked at like that, especially if you're trying to wait and buy your time so the person that you love eventually will notice you, even though because you go in his head that he does not give a shit about you. And to have an episode where you have different moments, either from the past episodes, getting a different perspective on what characters were thinking, because we have our set of main characters, we hear what they say out loud, but what is a character thinking in their mind? We don't really get to see that. So it's fun to see the different perspectives there as we build up her just really trying to be a part of this man's life, and she knows this teacher's no good. I mean, everyone knows this teacher's no good, unless you got the hots for her. Everyone admits that she is literally Satan herself. And the fact that she could, recognize that she has this ability, and the fact that it throws her off. Honestly, when that was revealed, I thought what was going to happen was she was going to get pushed off. If there was any death flag, it was on the character who could read people's minds, not her just having a slip and falling to her seemingly death. I think for an episode that, honestly, I thought it was just basic setup. I thought we weren't going to defeat war this episode. It'd mostly just be like, hey, we have our central characters, let's give, some more side characters at least a personality outside of being a backdrop for the audience. But to have it build up to something like that has my mind incredibly excited to see what's going to occur next. I mean, this episode, and just really the past month of Sonny Boy, has pretty much just been a completely new show, and that's not a bad thing in the slightest. It's definitely a show with a creative bone, for sure. It knows that it wants to be something different, and this really does feel like something that you would have discovered that came out in the 80s, and you're just like, yeah, I can understand why this is a cult classic. And I mean, I see more and more people every single week in the comment section saying this is actually my anime of the year right now, which is a pretty damn cool feeling, because Sonny Boy easily could have been something that like 2 people watch, but no, it has a good cult following, and I don't think it's ever gonna dip from here. Now, I honestly don't have too much more to say about this episode. I'm recording this a week ahead of time, but it's not long enough to really release by itself, so we'll go into the next episode's review, and obviously, yeah, we'll see where it goes from here. Now, I have to be honest, I didn't think they were going to commit to the death. I really was expecting this episode, or potentially next week, to come around and say, nope, she actually lives. Nozomi didn't end up dead, and maybe when they reach the world, given the fact that they're not even convinced that they will be themselves, it could be completely different, maybe she'll be there, but still, wasn't expecting it, especially because I think for so long, many of us were looking at this show as like, we have to defeat God, or we have to overcome this trial, and the fact that only 2 ended up willingly leaving by the end, the rest just doing their own thing in these individual this worlds, is something that's quite fascinating. And to have an episode like this, which I'm really glad that I'm joining the 2 reviews together, because the idea of death was a really interesting concept, because what is death in a world where you can live thousands and thousands of years, and then the concept of death is kind of similar to your original world, but also vastly different. Where do you go with that knowledge that you get a postcard saying, yeah, we were trying to defeat war and she ended up dead. Apologies, bro, but she's gone. how do you deal with that grief when the one other person who is going to go with you out of this reality and task themselves at trying to go back home to something similar? Potentially, she would have died going into that because she apparently did die in their original world. It's a heartbreaking episode, and to see the different stages of grief, having Best Boy Raj come back in to help them essentially build a space shuttle so they can get back home, or at least attempt to do so. Having to leave behind the cats, having to leave behind Yamabiko, and just having Raj really just appreciate where he's at, because he's very much a curious cat. Curiosity killed the cat, which I thought was a great message for him, because he's someone who would constantly want to explore and see new things, so makes sense that he would want to stick by this world and kind of carry on with that legacy. But the idea of them just setting off, potentially dying, like, it's weird because on one hand, thinking about a character as important as Nozomi just dying and just being gone and looking at the funeral, looking at their grief, I would think I would be more put off by. But there's something because of the time they've been there and that things can quickly end the same quickness that they can begin. It's sad some characters will be more struck by than others, but ultimately things have to come to an end, and I think that's one of the most natural parts of being human, that nothing does last forever, which is ultimately why they want to go back home, right? Because as much as it can be fun being with people for that amount of time, eventually things are going to run a little boring, a little more mundane. And this is what makes Sonny Boy such a fascinating series to me, because it's one of those shows that I'm so glad I decided to cover weekly, because when I read the comments, I see so many varying opinions and beliefs about what messages means. I mean, we had a giant conversation with Raj in this episode. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interpretations on that. And that's what makes it so great. For me, like, I come out of this episode, this latest one, episode 11, saying it's pretty much accepting what death is. Accepting that, do you want death to be something that does happen and will happen to everyone, or do you want to kind of stick by this world where the concept of death is pretty hard to come by? It's something that you have to accept for yourself. A curious scientist would want to stick by as long as possible, but a couple of humans who maybe are a little scared that when they go back to their world, they won't be friends, that the relationship they have right now won't mean anything because it'll be a different reality potentially. But it's something that they're willing to go after, and I think that's really interesting. And I mentioned it, I believe, because I recorded it a while back, but in last week's video, which is a part of this video, I think I touched upon how there's definitely been a lot more music. This episode kicks off with a song. I mean, it ends with the ending song, which is amazing, but I like how the end of the series has a lot more music than the beginning, because I think music tells a lot more, especially if you look at that funeral scene. You want something emotional with music playing. You can tell they're crying, you can tell they're frantic, but you don't need to hear them actually say it. And it was nice to see some real emotion between these two, because it's a pretty heartbreaking thing, especially for someone like Mizu, who had to leave her cats behind. Sonny Boy is a trip. It's something that, I mean, there's definitely going to be smarter people out there who can analyze it better than myself, but it's a show that I love covering, and I'm excited to see how episode 12 is going to conclude it. I mean, if you actually really take a look at how long the episodes run, we really got like a 14 and a half, 15 episode series, given the fact that we don't kick off with an opening, and usually the actual runtime of the episode is like 24 minutes, so it's pretty great to see how much they're able to do. And the fact that they don't beat around the bush in moments like these is something that normally I wouldn't be a fan of, but it surprisingly works well here. But let me know your thoughts and feelings, either on last week's episode or this latest one down below, theories on how it might end next week. Leave a like if you enjoy, and subscribe if you're new around here. So until next time, everyone, please take care and have a good one.